Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to once again present Bryan Stevenson in conversation with NPR's Michel Martin.
Thank you all so much for being here. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear Mr. Stevenson?
Hello, hello, yes.
Perfect. Okay. We are so delighted to spend this time with you. Chuck, thanks for pointing out, people always ask us, they said, oh, is this your first time in Montgomery? And I am delighted to say, no, it is not. I've been here many times, and I'm so delighted to see old friends, and I'm so delighted to meet new friends, and I'm especially honored to have this opportunity to speak with you, Bryan Stevenson, and congratulations on this wonderful honor. And I'm so moved by the fact that you've been honored many times for your legal work, but I'm wondering what it means to you to be honored for the humanities, which has such a powerful meaning.
Yeah, well, this is, first of all, a great day for me to be honored on the same program with someone like John Lewis is just overwhelming. He was such a mentor, and he was so generous, and spending time with him was so inspiring to me, and we got to talk a lot, particularly in the last few years, and I was just curious about his whole life, and he told me about growing up in Pike County and the lessons he learned there, but he also told me that you have to keep fighting, and so I'm really honored by this, and I have to say how moved I was by that beautiful poem. Ms. Jones, thank you for those kind and incredible words and for your brilliant mind. But it means the world because I feel like the humanities are essential to how we move forward, how we think about these issues, these complex issues. It's often difficult without all access to the humanities. I feel like I'm the product of a generation of people. I stand on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less, and the pandemic has caused me to think more about the people who lived here a generation ago, who would put on their Sunday best and go places to protest and fight for voting rights. And they knew when they got there, they'd be on their knees praying, and they were going to get battered and bloodied and beaten, and yet they still went. And the courage of that conviction really does inspire me, and it's what makes this kind of recognition so precious and so wonderful. So I'm really deeply honored by this.
It is interesting, though. I'm imagining when you first arrived here, I think people may not remember that you've been here so long, you've lived here so long, that you were not born here. You're actually born in Delaware, you're educated elsewhere. Did you honestly think you'd be here this long?
It's embarrassing, but I never thought about the future in terms of my own personal career when I was doing the work. I just, I knew that there were these critical needs. When I went to Georgia for the first time and met people on death row who were literally dying for legal assistance, and I felt like maybe I could contribute to that, I said, I have to do that. And when the needs in Alabama were so acute in 1989, 25% of the people executed nationally were here in the state of Alabama. We were getting desperate calls from people who didn't have lawyers, who had execution dates. I just felt, well, maybe I can help with that, so I've got to do that. And I never had a 3-year plan or a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan. I just felt that I had to do the work where it needed to be done. And so, no, I didn't imagine that. And in fact, I was just kind of living this temporary existence and began to deal with the realities, because back in those days it was hard. In 1989, our bulletin board, which is a publication that prints housing notices, still printed notices that had racial restrictions on them, even though that was invalid. And I remember trying to find a place to live and going to a neighborhood and showing up, and people would say no, and I found this place. I remember it was a hot August day. I found a place, and when the woman answered the phone, I kind of did something I don't usually do. I humiliated myself by saying, oh, I'm a lawyer, and I went to Harvard Law School. I'll be a great tenant. And she said, you sound great. And I went over to see her, and I remember putting on a suit because I wanted to make this impression, because I'd been having these issues, and I even borrowed someone's eyeglasses that I didn't need, because I thought the eyeglasses made me somehow, more harmless or something. I don't know. And I still remember opening the door. She opened the door. It was an older white woman, and she said, "Oh my God, you're black. I'm not going to rent to somebody who's black." And I think the hard thing for me was I wasn't dealing with housing issues. I had to deal with the issues that I was dealing with, and I struggled at that moment in whether this could be home, this could be community, when I was kind of dealing with that. But then I met other people who were so extraordinary, people like Johnny Carr and people like Reverend Gratz and people who were just doing incredible things. And that's why for me to be on this stage here in the city of Montgomery at this moment, being celebrated like this, is really overwhelming, but it's also deeply affirming about what we can do together as a community. That was the Montgomery in my lifetime in 1989, and I see us all here today. And that's why I feel like this work, this fight, this struggle is so vital, it's so important, because I feel like not only have things gotten to a place where I can see things that I couldn't see before, I think we can all see things that we haven't seen before, and that's the encouraging part.
But isn't that crazy, though? The fact that, I just have to pause and process the fact that this is not when dinosaurs walked the earth. No. I mean, this was when that kind of conduct was illegal, and everybody knew it was illegal, and yet it persists. And I'm wondering if, I'm just going to pause for a minute and ask all of you to think of a moment in your lifetime, that you did not think you would see. And let's just have that moment together. Let's just take a moment to think about a moment in our lifetimes that we never thought we'd see, and celebrate that together. And then I want to ask you, Trey was kind enough to point out that the sunflowers on your table, sunflowers are the national flower of Ukraine, in case you were wondering why he referenced that. So Trey, thank you for that. Do you see a connection between the work you're doing here and what we are tragically experiencing overseas?
I do. I think that much of my work is a response to what I call the politics of fear and anger. In the 1970s, we had 250,000 people, early 70s, 250,000 people in our jails and prisons. Today, we have 2.3 million people in our prisons. The United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. We have nearly 5 million people on probation or parole. There are 70 million Americans that now have criminal arrest histories, which means that when they try to get jobs or they try to get loans, they're disfavored and sometimes banned by that arrest history. 1 in 3 black male babies is projected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. And I say all of that because I think that was created by governance rooted in fear and anger. We had politicians in the 70s and 80s that said that people who are drug addicted and drug dependent are criminals, and we're going to use the criminal legal system to deal with that population, when we should have said that people struggling with addiction and dependency have a health problem and we need a healthcare response. And I believe that when you allow yourself to be governed by fear and anger, you tolerate things you should never tolerate. You accept things you should never accept. We have 13 states in America that have no minimum age for trying a child as an adult. So I'm representing 9 and 10-year-old kids in the state of Florida who are facing 50-year prison sentences in adult prisons.
Right now.
Right now.
Right now.
Right now. And we put children in these spaces where they're attacked. And I don't think anyone can actually justify that or believes that that's right, but we tolerate it because we've been made to feel afraid or angry. And the only way that bigotry, the only way that violence, the only way that discrimination prevails is when we feel too afraid or too angry to do the things we know we're supposed to do. And I think globally, we're seeing the same phenomenon. We're seeing parts in the world where people are being abused and mistreated because of their ethnicity, because of their gender, because of their religion. And wherever you go and you see abuse of other people, the perpetrators of that abuse can give you a narrative of fear and anger. And that's what we're hearing out of Russia. We're hearing a narrative that says, oh no, we have to do this to protect ourselves because we're afraid all of these terrible things are going to happen, or we're angry about lands that have been lost. And we're not talking about the basic rights of a whole community of people who are living peaceably on our borders. And we will tolerate that kind of incursion, that kind of invasion. We will tolerate abuse of people if we allow fear to cause us to be silent, or anger about our own issues to cause us to be indifferent. And so I do see a connection. The civil rights movement was about getting people to get past their fear of integration. And I just think we've now learned some things that ought to kind of teach us that that fear was not only irrational, but it should have been unacceptable. You know, why were we so hostile to the idea that black kids and white kids could be in the same space? You know, I've been telling the story recently about when I was a kid. My dad used to do domestic work, and he would take us places, and we, you know, would help him clean. We didn't really help. I was terrible at cleaning. I was just there. I wasn't, you know, really helping. But we lived near the beach, and you'd see all of these other kids in the hotel pools and things like that. And my sister and I just created this. We were preoccupied with swimming pools. And when integration came, they had a swimming pool in our community, the public pool. Black kids couldn't go there. And when integration came, they closed the pool, as they did throughout most of the South. And one day my mom came home and said, I've been saving money, and we're going to take a bus trip to the new Disney World, had just opened in Florida. This is early 70s. And we were so excited. And then my mom said, and we're going to stay in a hotel, and you're going to get in a swimming pool. And my sister and I were as excited about the swimming pool as we were about Disney World. And when the bus showed up, and we got on the bus, and my sister and I, we put our swimming trunks on underneath our clothes so we'd be ready for the pool. And we got to South Carolina where we stayed, and when that bus parked, I mean, we jumped off the bus, and we ran, and we found the pool. It was big and glorious. There were about 8 white kids in the pool. We didn't pay any attention to them. I was so happy that we had our trunks on underneath our clothes, and we ripped off our clothes. And I remembered saying to my sister, I said, Christy, I'm going to count to 3. We'll jump really high, and we'll land in the pool. And I grabbed her hand, and I said, 1, 2, 3. And we jumped high in the air, and we landed in the pool, and it was the most extraordinary feeling, that weightlessness, the coldness, the joy. It was so much fun. I still remember the joy of it. And we were so disoriented, we didn't pay attention to the shouting that had started. But the parents of these other children had started shouting at their kids, get out of the pool, get out of the pool, get out of the water. And I didn't understand what was happening, and they were screaming. And finally, there was one little kid left in the pool, a little 6-year-old boy. And this big guy, presumably his dad, started walking to the water, and he went over to this little boy, and he snatched him by the arm and pulled him out. And the little boy started crying. And I just didn't understand what was happening. And I remember turning to that man and looking at him and saying, excuse me, but what's wrong? And that's when this man looked at me and he said, you're wrong, nigger. And it wasn't the first time someone had used that word with me. But it just stunned me because it came after so much joy. Mm. They left and they were complaining about the kids, us getting in the pool, and I thought we were going to get in trouble. And I remember getting out of the pool and finding my mom and telling my mom what happened. She wasn't paying attention until I told her what the man said. And when I told her that, she got angry, and she said, are those people still near the pool? Mm-hmm. I said, no, I don't think so. She said, well, you get back in that pool. And at this point, we really didn't want to get in the pool anymore. Mm-hmm. And she said, no, you get back in that pool. And we did, and I went back and got in the pool. And then we went to Disney World the next day. We had fun. I remember the rides. I remember the food. But the thing I remember the most about that trip was getting back in that pool, holding my sister's hand, standing in a corner, and desperately trying not to cry. Mm-hmm. And as we got older, we had to shift that memory, as many people of color in this country have had to do, to overcome the humiliation and the denial of basic humanity that comes with segregation. And we changed the memory. I would say to my sister, I'd say, Christy, remember that time we went to South Carolina and we made those white people get out of the pool? And my sister would say, yeah, I remember that time, and she would really embellish it. If our friends were around, she'd say to our friends, she'd say, yeah, y'all, we went down to South Carolina, and I got on the edge of that pool. I said, all y'all white people get out of the pool. And then we would laugh because it was easier to carry the memory contained in that package than the actual package. But recently, I've been thinking about what were we afraid of in this country, in this community, when we said that these children can't be with these children. What were we afraid of? Because we need to understand the way fear works if we're going to make sure we don't replicate that. And I remember what happened on that day, and my biggest concern is that I worry that the white kids in that pool that day don't remember the day that their parents made them get out of a pool because 2 little black kids got in the water. Mm. I worry that they haven't talked about that. I worry that the man doesn't remember what he said to me. And if you're not required to remember the things like that, then you're vulnerable to replicating them today. And that is why it is so urgent that we confront the fear that we see around us, that we overcome those things. And these projects that we're doing are about memory, but more than that, they're about understanding the way in which we cannot be governed by fear, and we cannot be governed by anger. And authoritarianism is rising all over the globe, and it's rising here. And we have to recognize that that it poses. And so, yes, I do see a connection between what's happening in Ukraine and what our work is.
Well, one of the remarkable things that's happening in Ukraine and indeed with Russia is this effort to own the memory, to rewrite the past. I mean, central to the Russian invasion is a false narrative of history, that the Ukrainians are not people, that they do not deserve to exist, despite the fact that they have their own history, their own language, their own culture, and their own desire to govern themselves. I mean, this is, if you know, even just last week, the president of Russia issued a statement saying that Ukraine does not exist, does not have a right to exist. And I asked one of the scholars that I've been speaking to over the course of the week, is this a received history? Is this something that he was grown up thinking? Was he raised thinking that? I mean, were the children of his era in Russia all told that these people don't have a history and have no right to exist? And what he said was, yes, but he's taken it to a whole other level. Now, you know where I'm going with this, obviously, which is that we are in a moment when there are jurisdictions around the country who are literally trying to outlaw knowledge. They are taking books off the shelves. They're taking newspaper articles and outlawing the teaching of newspaper articles, which is quite remarkable to me that a thought experiment, the 1619 Project, which is a thought experiment, is a work of journalism, is somehow so dangerous and so powerful that it must be outlawed. Yeah. And I'm interested in your take on the origins of this movement, and what do you think it's about?
Well, I do think it is about creating a false narrative that allows people to not confront difficult truths. I mean, nobody's going to, subject themselves to chemotherapy or radiation treatment just because. But if you get a diagnosis that you have a life-threatening cancer, you will actually make those choices. And we've skipped the diagnosis part in understanding our history. We haven't allowed people to talk honestly about all of the harm and all of the injury that was done when we tolerated a genocide of indigenous people. I think we're a post-genocide society. I think what happened to Native people in this country was genocide. When Europeans came, we killed millions, and famine and war and disease shaped the lives of this community, and we shielded them from the equality and justice that we talk about in our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, but by creating a narrative, a false narrative, that they are racially different and therefore undeserving of these promises. And that narrative of racial differences is what we then used to tolerate 2.5 centuries of slavery. And that's why truth-telling is so important, because if you don't hear the truth, you become vulnerable to these manipulations. Most people in this room, a lot of people in this room, like I do, grew up in a time where your history textbooks referred to the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression, where slavery was taught as benign, that enslaved people were happy.
Part of the family.
Part of the family. And if we're not careful, we'll begin to adopt narratives around even the civil rights era. Sometimes I hear people talking about civil rights, and it sounds like a 3-day carnival. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on a bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. On day 3, we changed the laws and racism was over. And it would be great if that was our history, but that's not our history.
What do you say to people who think they're doing the right thing? Because clearly, many of the people advancing these efforts, some people advancing these efforts are autocrats looking for power. I think I'm sorry, I'm just going to assert that. But I think some people really genuinely think they're doing the right thing, of protecting their children from something painful that they feel they didn't have anything to do with. And why should they have to be burdened with these uncomfortable feelings? What do you say to that?
I say that the truth of who we are as a nation cannot be understood if we don't know all that we are, all that we've been. That's true for every society. And we can't skip that in America just because there's the use of power that can sometimes facilitate that. I mean, I think that's the difference between us and other countries. If you go to South Africa, they have an apartheid museum that talks honestly about the experience of apartheid. They had a truth and reconciliation process following apartheid where the truth of the pain and anguish of apartheid could not be diminished. And so it's in the air. It's part of the official record of what happened in that country. And you see that in Germany. If you go to Berlin, Germany, you can't go 200 meters without seeing markers and stones that have been placed next to the homes of Jewish families. All of those homes are being recognized, and they're places of honor for Jewish communities. The Holocaust Memorial sits in the center of Berlin, and when you go there, the cab drivers and the hotel operators encourage everybody to go to the Holocaust Memorial. And as a consequence, in Germany, there are no Adolf Hitler statues. It'd be unconscionable for someone to say, oh, let's honor the architects and perpetrators of the Third Reich and the Holocaust. But they had a shift in power in Germany. Germans lost the war. Black majority took over in South Africa. In this country, there hasn't been a shift in power. And so the debate is different. It's difficult because we actually have to persuade people who feel like they have the power to silence to choose not to be silent. And that's the genius, in my judgment, of John Lewis and Rosa Parks, is that they have made a moral argument to people that even though you have the power to silence others, you should not do it because it will make you vulnerable to living lives of fear and anger. You'll be separated from people who could enhance your life, who could bring quality to your life, who can bring beauty to your life. I come from a faith tradition, and in my tradition, we understand that you can't skip the truth part to get to redemption. I believe in truth and reconciliation, and truth and restoration, and truth and redemption, and truth and reparation, but I believe those things are sequential. You got to tell the truth before you get to the R part. And if you come to my church, you can't say, oh, I want heaven and salvation and redemption, but I don't want to own up to anything. I'm not going to acknowledge anything. The preachers are going to say, no, it doesn't work like that. You've got to confess and repent, and you shouldn't fear it, because when you open your heart like that, that's when redemption comes in. That's John Lewis's genius. He actually created space for people to actually do those things. And so what I want to say to those folks who are trying to keep us ignorant, who want to ban books about Rosa Parks and Dr. King and John Lewis, I would say you should not be afraid, because if you continue to live in fear, you will not thrive. You can't survive. I mean, I genuinely believe that the kind of truth that we're talking about, the truth that is represented in this room, where you have black people and white people and young people and old people all sitting together, all starting to feel something about what we can do in this city, in this state, the truth of that, the truth of an Alabama that breaks down the racial barriers, that wipes away all of that false narrative, that gives up on the lost cause, that stops honoring people who are white supremacists, that begins to think about how we create healthy communities. The truth of that is too great a truth to ultimately overcome. And that's why I believe I want to say to them, I understand your fear, and there was fear before you, and there was fear before that, but we need to learn from that fear that it's not sustainable, it's not rational, it's not healthy for me, and it's not healthy for you either. Because I think we did really terrible things to white children in this state when we told them that they're better than black kids because of their color, when told them that you shouldn't be with those people because they're different. That's a recipe for abuse and dysfunction. And it's not consistent with health. And that's ultimately what I'm hoping we can do, is to show people that we're really about a healthy community, and even a beloved community, where we can actually experience love with one another without the burden of bigotry, without the pain of discrimination, and without the violence of injustice.
I want to remind you that you can participate in our conversation. I told that questions will be coming our way soon. And why don't we do that now and open it up now, because then I want to talk a little bit more and then give Mr. Stevenson an opportunity to give us a closing thought. So great, thank you. Mm-hmm. All right, perfect. Oh, these are some good ones, thank you. You never know. Someone wants to know, when did you find your calling and how did you know?
Oh, wow. As I've said before, I grew up in a community where black kids couldn't go to the public schools, and lawyers came into the community to make them open up the public schools. And I was struck with the power they had, because if you had a vote in my community, the majority of the community would have voted against racial integration. And so I wanted to be a lawyer, in part because I love the power lawyers have to protect disfavored people, even when the majority of people don't want to protect those people. So I went to law school. I'd never met a lawyer until I got to Harvard Law School, and I was really struggling because it didn't seem like in my first year people were talking about equality or justice or race or poverty. I went to the School of Government to get a public policy degree that was even worse. They were teaching us to maximize benefits and minimize costs, and I was really struggling. And then I took a course that required me to spend a month with a human rights organization. I went to Atlanta, Georgia, to work with Steve Bright in a group called the Southern Prisoners Defense Committee, and they represented people on death row. They sent me down to Georgia's death row as a law student to meet people, and I was just supposed to explain that, you know, to this one person, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year, and I drove down there. I was so nervous because I felt totally unqualified. I'd never been to death row, never been to a maximum prison. They took me back to the visitation area. They brought this man into the room. He had all of these chains. He had shackles on his wrist, a chain around his waist, shackles on his ankles. And I remember being so nervous that I just started babbling. I just said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm just a law student. I don't know anything about the death penalty. I don't know anything about criminal procedure. I don't know anything about appellate procedure. I don't know anything about civil procedure." And his face was just dropping more and more as I kept saying what I don't know. And then I said, but I did come here to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that's when this man stopped. He said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And he said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And I remember that man grabbed my hands and he said, thank you, thank you, thank you. He said, you're the first person I've met in the 2 years I've been on death row who's not a death row prisoner or a death row guard. He said, I've been talking to my wife and kids, but I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid I'd have an execution date and I didn't want them to have to deal with that. He said, because of you, I'm going to see my wife, I'm going to see my kids. And we just started talking, and even though I was only scheduled to be there an hour, it turned into 3 hours. I just kept talking. He was asking me questions, I was asking him questions. We were exactly the same age, we had the same birth date, same month, same day, same year. And we just kept talking, and the guards were so angry that I'd stayed past my time that after 3 hours they came bursting into the room, and they were angry, and they grabbed this man, they threw him against the wall, they pulled his arms back, they put the handcuffs on his wrist, they wrapped the chain around his waist, they put the shackles on his ankles, and I was begging them to be gentler because they were so violent. I said, look, it's my fault, not his fault. But they were just pushing him, and they shoved him toward the door, and I never will forget them trying to push him out the door. And I kept saying, it's my fault, don't. And they were ignoring me. And then this man planted his feet, and as they were about to shove him through the door, he didn't move. And then he turned and he looked at me, and he said, Bryan, don't worry about this, you just come back. And I wrote about this because I watched this man then close his eyes, and then he threw his head back, and then he started to sing. And he started singing this hymn. He started singing, I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. And then he said, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. And everybody stopped. And the guards were covered, and they started pushing him down the hallway. And you could hear the chains clinging, but you could also hear this man singing about higher ground. And when I heard that man sing, everything changed for me. That was the moment that I knew I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. But more than that, I knew that my journey to higher ground was tied to his journey. I realized that if he doesn't get there, I can't get there. And it radicalized my interest in the law. I went back to Harvard Law School. You couldn't get me out of the law school library. I needed to know everything about federalism and comity and the doctrines. I needed to equip myself to help condemned people get to higher ground. And that's how I found my calling, was actually standing next to a condemned person and hearing him sing, and in his song, seeing his humanity, seeing his dignity, knowing that his life was worth saving. And that's why I keep talking about proximity, because I believe there's wisdom when we get close to people who suffer. There's power when we get close to people who are marginalized and excluded. There's insight, there's knowledge, and we should do it because we want to be a service to other people. We should also do it for ourselves, because who knows what song you'll hear that will change your life, that will deepen your conviction. Everything I understood before then changed. I grew up in the church, and I began to realize that in a society like ours, the felon Saul might not become the apostle Paul because we throw people away. We condemn and we kill and we execute. And I want to change a society like that because I realize that we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. I fundamentally believe that. And so that's how, the calling came to me, is because I understood then that even if you're on death row, it's not too late for redemption, it's not too late for grace, that there's still humanity, there's still dignity, and we should be fighting for that wherever we see it.
Well, thank you for that, because you never know who here needed to hear that today. We never know who here was struggling with something today, wondering whether they have a purpose yet. So thank you for that, because who knows who needed to hear that today. We have other questions, so
Yeah, okay.
let's get these.
Okay.
And there's a question segueing nicely to this. What's your advice for aspiring law students? And also, someone else wants to know if there is a way that undergraduate students can support this work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my basic advice is work hard. We need you to be as smart and as informed as you can possibly be. Really study hard. But I also want to say to each and every one of you that your capacity to make a difference in the world is not completely dependent on the grades you get. It's certainly not dependent on the money you have. I don't think that's the ultimate measure of what empowers you to do the things that need to be done. I tell my students this all the time. I want you to be strategic. I want you to be tactical. I want you to be informed. I want you to be intelligent. I want you to think critically. But I also want you to recognize that if you're going to advance justice, you're not going to advance justice by the ideas in your mind. You advance justice by the conviction in your heart. And that's why you have to care about the relationships you create with the people that are meaningful to you. That's why you shouldn't step away entirely from the communities that motivated you to want to be agents of change. You shouldn't step away from the places where you see suffering and inequality, even though that can be a painful thing. We have in our society the ability to protect ourselves and find safe and comfortable places and to exist disconnected from the things that we know are difficult. And I just say to students all the time, I hope you'll have the courage to not do that. I'm not against comfort, I'm not against convenience, but if you want to do justice, if you want to make a change, if we want to make a difference that can be felt by other people who are vulnerable, you have to be willing to do things that are uncomfortable, and you have to be willing to do things that are inconvenient. John Lewis taught me that sometimes you have to stand up even when people say, sit down. Sometimes you have to speak even when people say, be quiet. But if you understand the power of that, and you have this conviction to contribute to the world, to add love to the world, add justice to the world, add equality and equity to the world, then there's nothing you can't do.
Is that your way of telling us you didn't get very good grades?
I got good grades, but I was never really interested in those kinds of metric systems. I'm not against them. I want people to get good grades because I want them to study hard. I do. I just think I don't want anybody to feel like, well, because I didn't get into that program, or I didn't get into that school, or I didn't make it here, that I'm now out of the game. Because like I said, when I got to Harvard Law School, the first day, everybody stood up and they talked about, why they were in law school. Everybody had at least 2 generations of people in their families who had been lawyers. And I didn't have that. And there was a moment when I didn't tell people I went to a colored school. I didn't think that would help me. I didn't tell people my great-grandparents were enslaved. In that environment, I thought it would diminish me. But as I got a little wiser, I realized that it doesn't diminish me, it actually empowers me. If I'm sitting here doing anything, it's because I understand the pain of segregation. It's because my great-grandparents were enslaved and gave me the legacy of endurance. And so what I want to say to people is don't let the bad grade turn you around or make you think that it's too late for you, because it's not.
What songs and artists inspire you?
Wow. I love music. I love all kinds of artists. I've been thinking a lot about Mahalia Jackson. She's an artist that inspires me because people don't appreciate how committed she was to civil rights, to human rights. Mm-hmm. But she came to Montgomery during the boycott to raise money for the churches. And during that time, Dr. King's home was bombed. And she stayed another day to raise more money. And I was watching a video of her at the Newport Jazz Festival in the early 1970s, and they were celebrating Louis Armstrong's birthday. And she came out on stage and she just said some kind words about Louis Armstrong, and then she started singing Just a Closer Walk with Thee. And even in that setting, it was a mostly white jazz audience, but she just, she was out there, she had her piano player, and at some point she became so overcome with the idea that you have to keep pushing. She stepped away from the mic and she kept singing, but you couldn't really hear her, but she was still singing. And then Louis Armstrong came up on stage and he embraced her. And I think about artists like that because these are people who had to endure the humiliation of segregation. Even while they were performing for largely white audiences, they were still subjected to that second-class treatment, and they found a way to be brilliant and to perform and to have that kind of energy. I'm appreciating that now more than I ever have before because I realize the strength that that takes. But I love all the modern people as well. When we opened down here, I said this to my staff, when we were putting our concert together, we had all these great people came to come, Dave Matthews and The Roots, and all of these great folks came. But I kept saying, the person I really want is Stevie Wonder. And we couldn't reach him. It was just an impossible thing. And ultimately, we got word 3 days beforehand that he was going to come. And we stood down there at the river next to the amphitheater. And he told me about his mother, born in Eufaula, Alabama, and how she could never come back. And he had tears running down his face because he was talking about how meaningful it was to be near that river where he knew enslaved people had been trafficked, and to be in this space. And those of you who were there remember he sang a spiritual that night, something he had never done before. And I appreciate artists like that who have been unwavering in their commitment to use their talent, to use the humanities to advance justice. And there's so many that do that, but those are two that stand out.
I have one more question, which I think is a wonderful way to end. But before I ask this, because I think this is a wonderful way for you to finish our remarks here today, I am so struck by the fact that, I was very honored to be here to help open the museum when it was the little baby museum, and it was the big baby, the big brother museum, that's not a good expression at all. It's the big museum now. And what do you make of the fact that it has become such a significant tourist attraction and economic driver? The mayor of Montgomery, I spoke with him a couple of days ago, said it's one of the top 5 attractions in the state in a very short period of time, especially given everything that the whole country's gone through with travel and with the pandemic and so forth. I mean, what do you make of that? I mean, you told me earlier, just a little commercial here, we weren't able to put on a lot of our programming from Montgomery. We've been here all week. In fact, my team is here. I brought a team of folks down here. We've been here all week reporting from Montgomery, and a lot of our coverage will be on next weekend because we're sharing the space with the news from overseas. So I do hope you'll tune into that. Just a little tiny commercial for NPR, which we all hope you support.
Absolutely.
And check your local listings. And do support the pledge drives. The fact that it's become such a significant attraction, what do you make of that? What do you think that says?
I think people want the truth. I think we all want something better. I do. I really believe there is something better waiting for us in this country. There's something that feels more like equality, more like justice, more like freedom than any of us have yet experienced. But to get there, we have to do this work. And we open these sites to help people along that journey. And while it seems scary to some people and didn't seem like a thing that would draw people here, I think fundamentally we want something better. We don't want to live lives that are just merely tolerating the narratives that we've been given. We want something that breaks down those barriers. What I love about what young people are saying to do is they want something authentic and honest and true. And I think that's what this represents. I mean, I don't know why we had to do in Montgomery what no one has done in this country. I mean, I wasn't looking to do this, but when you go to the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg and you go to the Holocaust Memorial, you go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you realize we have not created space in this country that motivate people to deal honestly with those histories. And when you go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, no matter what your background is, when you come out of that museum, you are motivated to say, never again. You see a pile of shoes, the remnants of people who were killed. You're motivated to say never again. And what we're trying to do are to create sites that motivate everyone when they leave to say never again should we tolerate racism and bigotry and injustice the way we have tolerated it in our country. And I think people are yearning for something that gets us past the new purpose that we put in our new museum. What we say is, the purpose of this museum is to create a space that helps us advance a society where the children of our children are no longer burdened by the legacy of slavery, no longer burdened by racism and bigotry, no longer subjected to presumptions of dangerousness and guilt and injustice. And I think people want that. And it's just work we have to do. But that's what I think has caused people to come. And I'm excited by that, because the more people who come, the more I'm affirmed and excited about what we can do to achieve that better day.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I'm just going to take a moment of personal privilege just to say thank you. It's been a delight to be with you once again. I'm so glad this worked out. I want to thank my NPR team, wherever they are, for the work that, there they are, hello, who came to Washington. We've been here all week. We had a colleague came from Birmingham to support our work. I want to thank Chuck for inviting me to be part of this once again, and I want to thank all of you who were here today to share this time with us. It's truly been a delight, especially for those of us who haven't had the opportunity to wear real clothes for 2 years and to be with people, put our sneakers and our sweats away to get ourselves polished up to be part of this really special event. And I'm going to close with a question from the audience, which really follows some of the beautiful words we heard from the Lewis family earlier. And I was so happy to hear those words, and someone wants to know, and I want to know, how you find the hopefulness and motivation to continue to do this work.
Yeah, I'm constantly seeing things that inspire me, and I can end with this. If you go to our museum, there's a big exhibit, and it's an exhibit with jars of soil. As you know, when we opened the memorial, we started this project where we're going around the country and we're asking communities to reckon locally with their history of lynching. And so we invite people to go to lynching sites and dig the soil from the lynching site and put it in a jar with the name of the lynching victim and the date, and then bring it back to Montgomery, and we put it in our exhibit to honor that person, but to also encourage the kind of tangible activism that goes in remembrance. And we did one of these events a couple of years ago here in Alabama, and there was a middle-aged black woman who came, and she was unhappy because her sister was supposed to come with her, and her sister didn't come, and so she wasn't sure she could do it by herself. But we had the meeting, and people kind of got fired up, and afterwards she said, "Oh, Mr. Stevenson, I'm going to go do it." And we gave her a jar, and we gave her the implement, we gave her the memo, and it turns out that her location was in a pretty remote section of West Alabama. And when she got there, she was terrified because it was on a dirt road. It looked really scary, but she said, "No, I'm going to do this." And she went to the site where the lynching took place, and she got down on her knees, and she was about to start digging, and a truck drove by, a pickup truck drove by, and there was a big white guy in the truck, and he slowed down and stared at her as he drove by. And she said she started getting really nervous, and then the man stopped his truck, turned it around, and drove back by again and stared at her some more. And then to her horror, he parked his truck, got out of the truck, and started walking toward a big guy. And we tell people when they go do the soil collections that they don't have to explain what they're doing. They can just say, "You're getting dirt for your garden." And she told me that. I was just going to tell that man, "I'm getting dirt for my garden. You don't have to bother me." And the man came over, and sure enough, he said, "What are you doing?" And then she said, "Mr. Stevenson, something got a hold of me." And I told that man, "I'm digging soil because this is where a black man was lynched in 1937, and I'm going to honor his life today." She said she started digging real fast, and the man just stood there. And then the man said, "Does that paper talk about the lynching?" And she said, "It does." And then he said, "Can I read it?" And she gave the man the paper, and he stood there reading while she started to dig. And after the man read the paper, he put it down, and he said, "Excuse me, ma'am, but would it be all right if I helped you?" And she said, "Yes." And the man got down on his knees, and she offered him the implement to dig the soil. He said, no, I don't need that. I'll just use my hands." And he started throwing his hands into the soil and putting it in the jar, and he kept throwing his hands into the soil. And she said there was something about the conviction with which he was picking up the soil and putting it that just moved her. And the next thing she knew, she had a tear running down her face. And the man stopped. He said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm upsetting you." And she said, no, you're blessing me. And she kept digging, and he kept digging, and they got toward the top of the jar, and she noticed that the man had slowed down. And she looked over at him, and his face had turned red, and his shoulders were shaking. And she put her hand on his shoulder and she said, "Are you all right?" And that's when the man looked at her and he said, "No, ma'am, no, ma'am." He said, "I'm just so worried that it might have been my grandfather that participated in lynching this man." And she said they both sat there on the roadside and wept. And then he said to her, he said, "Ma'am, I want to take a picture of you holding the jar of soil." And she said, "Well, I want to take a picture of you holding the jar of soil." And they took pictures of each other. And then she said, "Well, I'm going back to Montgomery to give this to the museum people." And he said, "Would it be all right if I followed you?" And they both came to Montgomery to contribute that jar of soil to our exhibit. And I'm not naive enough to believe that beautiful things like that happen every time you tell the truth. But I am persuaded that when we don't tell the truth, we deny ourselves the beauty that is justice. And so when I see those jars and I meet people like that, I'm constantly energized and constantly affirmed to believe the things that I believe, to do the things we're trying to do. And that's the beautiful thing about justice work. And I know John Lewis understood this. You just keep your eyes on the prize and you hold on, and you'll be amazed by all the ways in which people and others will kind of carry you along the way. And I don't feel in any way overwhelmed or overburdened by this. It's overwhelming and there are challenges, but I feel really uplifted because I'm surrounded by people who keep encouraging and keep affirming the importance of advancing justice. And so that keeps me going. I can't complain. I don't have any complaints about the kind of work I do. I feel really privileged to just contribute in a small way to this broader goal of human rights.
Bryan Stevenson, it's a delight.
Thank you. Thank you.